Thanks for the welcome, and thanks, Michael, for the introduction as well. It's lovely to be here. Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm going to work from notes a bit more than normal just to try and keep myself to time. So bear with me a little. All right. Okay, so I'm going to begin almost 10 years ago on the 9th of April, specific date, the 9th of April 2007, when this article appeared in the New Statesman by former MP Ruth Kelly, which is her. Its title was, as you can see, Time for a British Version of Islam. And in it, the then Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, she was then, made a brief case, citing individuals like Tariq Ramadan, for integration of, in her words, faith and country. By sheer coincidence, Kelly's statement coincided exactly with the release of this document on the left, which Preventing Violent Extremism, Winning Hearts and Minds, a communities and local government publication that signalled the emergence of the vast policy machinery whose aim is to reduce the appeal of violent extremism in the UK, and which we tend to know today as PREVENT, as Michael was mentioning. So fast forward to 2016, and I think these kinds of pronouncements have become rather familiar. Last December, for example, Baroness Sayeeda Warsi, who recently has become among the most effective critics of government policy around Muslims, called for changes to the architecture of UK-based mosques as part of a drive to, quote, develop an authentically British brand of Islam. Mosques that look like that perhaps, sort of minaret attached to suburban house or something like that. And then 6 weeks later, just last month, actually 2 months ago now, it's March, isn't it? BBC One broadcast a debate some of you may have seen, although I can't still bring myself to watch it, on the show The Big Questions, entitled, Do We Need a British Islam? Conservative politicians have followed Labour. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, has become familiar for stressing the need for Muslims in Britain to accept a collection of imprecisely specified British values. And again, this emphasis on Britishness emerges in tandem with the Conservatives' newest iteration of PREVENT policy, as in the document on the right there, which places statutory burdens on public institutions, universities included, to give due regard to the risk of terrorism, and which is defined in terms of opposition to British values. Now, so certain things, I think, are common to these particular calls. First of all, they seem to mark Islam out a priori as in some way wanting. The view seems to be that Islam, either because of prejudices directed toward it, or more often, I think, Muslims' supposed unwillingness to integrate into British society, stands apart in the UK, kind of in Britain but not of Britain. And a British Islam is needed, therefore, because acculturation to British norms and ways has not or not yet happened. Second, these calls are almost always linked to the instrumental justification of thwarting Islamist extremism. The impression given thereby is that, were it not for the issue of extremism, no one would really care about this. And then third, these calls are not made about any other religious tradition in the UK, not Jews, Hindus, Sikhs, and certainly not Christians. So the implication seems to be that Islam in Britain is not only deficient, but kind of uniquely deficient. It's unsurprising, therefore, that calls for British Islam, I think, are frequently equated with negativity towards the Muslim population of the UK. Objections among Muslim organisations, researchers of Muslim Britain, have been plentiful, while sympathisers outside of media and government, at least, are fairly few and far between, I think it's fair to say. Indeed, such criticism can be separated into distinct groups, advancing slightly different arguments. I'll run through them quickly. So first, there are theological objections. So I've given this kind of talk, or something similar to it, at a variety of locations now, and including Islamic institutions. And when I have done, sometimes the idea of British Islam has been viewed as an affront to Islam's universalist ethic. To talk of a national version of Islam is to confine both geographically and morally, the message of a prophet who was sent, as the Quran has it, as a mercy to humankind rather than a rather privileged portion of it that lives on these islands. And second, there are historical objections. There are those who regard talk of the need for a British Islam as short-sighted. Calls for British Islam seem to imply, after all, that Islam is something that has come to Britain and now needs to adapt to Britain. And in fact, such has been the global impact of British colonialism that there are, it can seem, few Muslim traditions the world over that haven't in some way been shaped by the UK. After all, Wahhabi Islam attained the prominence it has in part due to British efforts to secure oil mining concessions in the early 20th century. The context for the emergence of the Salafi movement in Egypt, illustrated with the central image there, was set by the British occupation of Cairo in 1882. And then the two largest Islamic traditions in Britain, in terms of population numbers, the Deobandi and Barawi, were both established in a direct response to British rule in India. Deobandi tradition represented on the left. So, in a sense, when people like Ruth Kelly ask, where is British Islam, you're almost tempted to say, where on earth isn't it? So third, there's an influential strand of I'm a sociologist by discipline, I should say, and there's an influential strand of sociological theory, I think of which the late Ulrich Beck is perhaps the clearest example, that sees the nation-state almost as something irrelevant or approaching irrelevance, or dangerous, or both at the same time. And authors taking this kind of perspective tend to take as their focus the emergence of new transnational Islamic formations, movements and identities. And on this view, a kind of British Islam isn't bad politics or just bad politics, but bad sociology as well. So today Islam is of interest primarily because it has gone global. And the increasing salience of transnational Islamic identities is further evidence for the nation-state's declining strategic significance in late modernity. Fourth and final, and I think most common, there's a sizable body of academic and media opinion, mainly but not only on the liberal or radical left, that is convinced that advocacy of British Islam entails some kind of ideological disciplining, you might say. The call for British Islam is, when all is said and done, a call to support the actions of the British state, especially the military. This concern is most explicitly expressed, I think, in debates about Muslims' support for the armed forces or the Queen. You can see there certain newspaper responses to ISIS, and then on the left a debate around the wearing of poppy hijabs that occurred in 2014. And there are a lot of these kind of views tend to take the position that those calling for British Islam, what they want is to assimilate Muslims into a secularized Christian culture and ultimately almost extinguish Islam as a distinctive identity and as an independent moral tradition. So, I think given the range of criticisms there, it can actually be quite hard to find people either within Muslim communities or in the community of researchers of Muslims in Britain, I sometimes think, who will speak positively about the notion of a kind of British Islam. So freighted with baggage, you might say. I mean, informally, I've seen it dismissed by colleagues as kind of a nonsense, a sort of daft idea dreamt up by daft politicians. Nevertheless, I want to do something like that here. It's not, I should say, that I want to disagree with any of the arguments I've just put on the board, all of which I think are, for the most part at least, valid. Nevertheless, what I want to try and argue is that these critiques risk neglecting what I'm going to call institutional transformation of Islam in Britain. So, for example, in the theological case, I think recognition of Muslims' aspirations towards a kind of ethical universalism should not necessarily mean you can't highlight how, to borrow a term used by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, in the Christian context, Muslims have learnt to speak with a particular accent. Everyone speaks a religion with an accent, is his position, and it doesn't. And Christianity is a universal religion, so is Islam, but it's also always expressed in a particular form. The historical position is one I should say I agree with entirely, but even while agreeing, I think you can still point to ways in which Middle Eastern, South Asian movements in Britain have started to differ from their contexts of origin. In the sociological case I spoke about, the work of scholars such as Olivier Roy and Peter Mandeville, I hope I'm pronouncing both their names correctly, has been of huge importance in undermining clash of civilizations style rhetoric by drawing attention to the modernity of Islamic movements and what the former calls the deculturation of Islam. Yet there is nevertheless, I think, in this work a real danger of failing to give sufficient space to the ways in which European Islam has set down institutional roots. I think that's an issue particularly in Roy's work, less so in Peter Mandeville's, if I'm honest. Then finally, the political argument, which of course, as you may guess from what I've said already, I think has considerable weight. Following Kelly's article in 2007, I should note, literally hundreds of millions of pounds were invested by New Labour into capacity building initiatives that effectively had the aim of remaking Islam in Britain. These proceeded in tandem with what Kelly described in 2006, a year earlier, as a rebalancing of relations between Muslims and the state. And in plain English, what this meant is former partners of the government, Muslim organisations, being shunned, in part, not entirely, but in part because of their opposition to British foreign policy. I think Muslim opposition to the British state has become harder still since New Labour left office in 2010. The Conservatives' statutory implementation of their vague definition of extremism as vocal and active opposition to British values has led to, for example, a schoolboy recently being questioned by anti-terrorism police solely because he wore a Free Palestine badge to school. Yet at the same time, there is a danger, I think, of only understanding British Islam on the state's terms, and as a consequence, opposing the notion as a whole rather than the UK government's specific construction of it. Traditionally, I think, nationalism's firmest advocates and its fiercest critics have both, in a way, agreed that identification with a nation-state means, when all is said and done, support for its leaders and for its military. One is, in a sense, the mirror of the other, the two contending positions. And neither, I think, leaves space for alternative ways of feeling national belonging. I mean, for my own part, I've always been suspicious of this kind of mirror opposition, in large part because I'm quite comfortable with my own British and English identity, but also I'm descended from conscientious objectors. G.K. Chesterton, illustrated in the bottom there, who was a Catholic author and wrote at a time when Catholics were arguably subject to comparable prejudice to Muslims today, put a critique of this kind of view rather well when he said, "A man who says that no patriot should attack the Boer War until it is not over is not really worth answering intelligently. He is saying that no good son should warn his mother off a cliff until she has fallen over it." I think in the same way, a sort of strong anti-British Islam position leaves little room for alternative ways for thinking about what British Islam might mean, and runs the risk of unfairly aligning those who are trying to think in a different way with the government position. Or positions, perhaps. Government is not necessarily a uniform entity. We might think of British Islam as a kind of institutional form that has, as it were, learnt to speak the language. But this is not quite the same as agreeing with the people with whom one is speaking, or even agreeing about the social situation within which a conversation takes place. You might have noticed, as I was going through those sort of counterpositions, so to speak, I used the past perfect tense a few times. Something has happened to Islam, something has actually changed within it. And that alludes to a kind of empirical transition that is central to the argument I'm going to try and make over the course of this talk. I said a moment ago that calls for British Islam almost always find Islam wanting a priori, that is to say, before considering evidence. In contrast, I think the concept of a British Islam can be valuable in a way, but this is an argument that I have reached very slowly and, to use the kind of contrasting Latin term, a posteriori, after considering the evidence. I mean, personally, Kelly's article appeared in the UK press, as it happens, pretty much the exact time I started empirical research into British Muslims, about 10 years ago. And when it was written, I didn't really sympathise, I have to say, with the idea of British Islam in any significant way. And gradually I've kind of come round to the position by considering different forms of evidence through the process of conducting research. I mean, I've been looking at institutionalised Islam for around 10 years, as I say, and so I'm going to focus on three what we'll call institutional domains this evening. So education is the first, law is the second, and Muslim-state relations is the third. And within each of these contexts, one can trace a process of institutional change, or so I'm going to argue. Again and again, one finds comparable transitions that I think add up to quite a powerful argument. That's not to say you could make this kind of argument you couldn't make this kind of argument using other kind of institutional case studies. Indeed, I think what you probably could do is make a case for a British Islam solely based on survey data, which shows a very high level of identification with the notion of Britishness among the British Muslim population. But what I think one can do with these contexts specifically is mount a reasonable challenge to the kind of political position I started out with. So I'm going to try and take them one by one and come back to the broader argument at the end. But before I go into the details, I think it's worth first saying something about what is kind of underlying the changes I'm going to describe. So I'm going to argue that British Islamic institutional structures are shifting in their orientation, but I think if this is the case, I think it's in part because the kind of the human foundations on which they rest are themselves moving. I'm just going to try and illustrate that very quickly. So there have been some quite profound socio-demographic changes within Britain's Muslim population. I'm going to just mention one very quickly. The unemployment rate within Muslim women, among Muslim women, sorry. So British Muslim women's high rates of unemployment is widely recognised in academic writings on Muslims in Britain. The proportion of out-of-work Muslim women is considerably higher than it is for other South Asian religions. So I think the figure from the 2011 census is 38.6% of British Muslim women long-term out of work, who have never worked, or are long-term unemployed. That's from the 2011 census. And that compares with 14.6% for British Hindus and 13.7% for British Sikhs. Although these are partly ethnic effects rather than religious effects per se. So it's a statistic one has to take with a certain degree of a sort of pinch of salt. But what is increasingly clear, and this is what's on this bar graph I'm just about to explain, is that Muslim women who have, so to speak, been formed within the British context are gaining access to the professions. So among the population of England and Wales as a whole, which is the orange blobs you can see, unemployment rates decrease with age. The younger you are, the more likely you are to be out of work. So among 16 to 24s, that's on the left, 6.8% of the female population of Britain as a whole is long-term unemployed, while among 50 to 64s, the same figure is 3.6%. For Muslim women, however, this pattern is reversed in the most dramatic way, as you can see by the purple bar graphs. So the unemployment rate moves from 17.7% on the left there up to 54.6% for the 50 to 64 age group. And you get to the point where on the left, among younger age groups, those differences might or even be explicable in terms of differences of class, to use the sociological term. So just the fact that Muslims generally in Britain tend to be from poorer areas of the country than the majority population. There's even some kind of indications that with girls outperforming boys in school generally, Muslim women are actually entering prestige professions such as medicine at a higher rate than men. So, to add to this isn't so much of a statistical point, it's a sort of more a looser observation, but I want to add a point about cohorts. So both, I think, in academic and popular coverage of British Muslims, attention tends to fall on the young. 3 books have been published with some variation on the title Young British and Muslim since 2007, and there's another one coming out in 2016. Now, all these books are very good, I should say. I recommend them highly, and the one that's coming out. And there are good reasons for this kind of focus. But what I think we perhaps neglect, that is we researchers of Muslims in Britain, and are those parts of the British Muslim population that are born here but are now established in their careers and beginning to move into senior leadership roles. I think we're probably now past the point where over half of Muslims in Britain were born in this country. So I think in 2011 census it was something like 47.2% were UK born. That's probably higher now. And some of these are sort of slowly moving into middle age. Middle age meaning someone who's around 35. I know some people around 50 or 60 like to define themselves as middle age. That's not how I do it. And achieving senior positions in prominent civil society organisations. Reshaping them, I think, as they do so. The most obvious illustration of that is the phenomenon of what you might call publicly active former extremists, one of whom is on the top middle there, Majid Nawaz. Of course, I think for anyone such as myself who tries to kind of convey a sense of the rich tapestry of British Muslim life, the undivided attention the media tends to give to former extremists in documentaries like ITV's Jihad, A British Story, can be quite frustrating, has to be said. Yet the very fact that these figures can appear on TV is, I think, a reminder in a way of time moving on. And I think beyond this specific case of former extremists, these kind of transitions are beginning to have an effect. So I'm going to turn to my first case study, so Islamic education. Now, so what I've called a priori narratives about British Islam are regularly applied in this context. It's been repeatedly claimed that in the UK, Muslims are being badly served by Islamic educational institutions and so often sometimes specifically Deobandi educational institutions, which are the kind of predominant forms in the UK, which supposedly at least transmit knowledge of texts, sometimes in a foreign language, but do not equip students with the interpretive tools to kind of understand the wider British culture. Here, for example, is Paul Goodman. He's former Conservative Shadow Minister for Communities Local Government, and this is a quote from him. British mosques and madrasas are dominated by elderly men from abroad who don't speak English and have limited means of communication with the younger generation. This leaves young British Muslims vulnerable to exploitative English-speaking Al-Qaeda operatives. The solution to this seems obvious. Open up the mosques, bring in young English-speaking people to run them. Above all, monitor the masjids and madrasas, inspect them, regulate them, control them, and subject them to a blizzard of best practice and quality standards guidance that's done so much for local government. Now, broadly speaking, this, I think, quite illiberal argument gives a rough but reasonable description of government policy as well as it does this particular viewpoint. And it helps understand the state's actions and policies since 2007. For example, 2007, the year the Prevent strategy I mentioned at the start came out, saw a faith leaders training initiative aimed primarily at Muslim faith leaders and set up by CLG. Government also encouraged bridge building between Islamic colleges of higher education via the commissioning of reports and the narrowing of the naming of Islamic studies as a strategically important subject by HEFCE. That is the Higher Education Funding Council for England, by the way. And now, those particular moves I'm personally quite supportive of as it happens, but those kind of supportive moves have usually been accompanied by more coercive and restrictive changes. The most recent examples of these being the Conservatives', I think, rather worrying proposals to regulate much more strictly faith-based education centres, and even, I don't know how far this is in the in creation, but the creation of a national register of faith leaders, which has got some media coverage recently. So, you might ask, how does this reflect research literature on Islamic education in the UK? Now, certainly, I think it's possible to substantiate Paul Goodman's claim up to a point. Deobandi institutions do undoubtedly, I think, at times reflect the anti-British and anti-modern outlook of their original founders. Researchers who've studied these kind of institutions in the early 2000s and mid-2000s wrote of places where there is, I quote, little structured interaction with wider society. Sophie Gilliatt-Ray, of course, from this centre, has described them as existing in a social world fearful of cultural annihilation, in which a blanket suspicion of virtually all outsiders prevails. Yet, crucially, I think, this is far from the full picture. The situation is not simply one of intransigent Islamic institutions that need to be forcibly reformed or made British, if you will, by the powerful instruments of public policy. Firstly, to the extent that this is a particular issue, it's one that's been recognised by at least some Muslim religious leaders since at least around 1990, so way back in time, before the creation of any kind of public policy interest in this area. Indeed, there are a number of new institutions and courses that have been set up with the explicit aim of trying to act as a bridge between the traditional Darzi Nizami curriculum and already existing British professions and qualifications frameworks. Examples include an early one, the Muslim College in Ealing, the Cambridge Muslim College, it's a website, and the Markfield Institute of Higher Education, one of whose staff came to speak here, I understand, a couple of weeks ago in Leicestershire, here where I grew up. I think the latter case, actually, the Markfield Institute, is particularly remarkable because in the past that institute and its sister organisation, the Islamic Foundation, has been closely associated with Jamaat-e Islami, the revivalist movement in Pakistan and Bangladesh, and characterised by the overarching aim of what Sean McLaughlin has called countercultural Islamisation. And the Institute, I think, its gradual move over the process of many decades away from this kind of countercultural perspective represents a really striking case of the kind of institutional changes that I'm trying to pick up on. I think it's kind of sad that that story of that institution is not more widely known beyond a kind of select group of specialist researchers. And that's particularly the case, I think, as Michael said, I've done some research in Leicester, and I think on the basis of that, a strong case can be made that the context for that particular institutional change was provided by local and national state engagement in interfaith organisations and so on. And that particular case seems to challenge the Conservative government's current stance that if an Islamic organisation takes any kind of a radical or anti-British values perspective, the best response is to ostracise it and not engage with it. So alongside these formal institutional responses, we can also find initiatives that have bypassed formal college settings. Good examples of these include an organisation called Maslahah, which I work with briefly. It's an educational charity based in Tower Hamlets in East London, and also the Radical Middle Way, which grew out of the Muslim magazine Q News. I think interestingly, actually, and quite importantly, these two organisations on the right and left have very different relationships to the state. The Maslahah on the right have shunned, since their founding, any kind of central government funding, especially any link to preventing extremism policies. And the latter, the Radical Middle Way on the left, that has been was largely dependent on prevent funding. And it's notable that in recent years, Maslahah has kind of continued to be active, whilst Radical Middle Way has had to scale down considerably, largely due to the context of austerity. I think perhaps most importantly of all, I think some of the most recent, and I think the best research into Deobandi Darul Ulooms, notably by Ron Geeves there, has revealed that some of the stereotypes about the teaching in these kind of institutions does not always stand up to scrutiny. Learning, he says, is not always rote or abstract. The language of instruction varies. Both staff and higher level students are keen for pupils of the institutions to go on to get a higher level qualification. And indeed, some of the institutions, Darul Uloom in Blackburn, for example, which is near where I live now, have been in discussion with mainstream higher and further education institutions about the accreditation of courses. Then, of course, there is the case which will be well known to many of the people who work in this centre, of course, of Muslim chaplaincy, the emergence of a kind of new professional class of Muslim professionals. Half of these Muslim chaplains being educated in Deobandi institutions, now working, of course, in predominantly secular context, hospitals, prisons and so on, and serving British Muslims from all kinds of ethnic and theological backgrounds. So a kind of a distinctive development, I think, is in many ways, it's not particularly glamorous, but it is important. And it's interesting as well that Muslim chaplaincy, because there has been demand for specific Muslim women's chaplaincy, has created a sort of space for new Muslim women's leadership. So considered individually, all of these cases don't amount to much, but taken together, you can kind of see a gradual trajectory appearing. So on to the next case, Islamic law. So Islamic legal institutions, I think, differ from educational institutions in one important respect. So both of these kinds of institutions were founded by, and the majority I think are still led by, an older generation of British Muslims. Yet while most mosques and educational institutions initially sought to try and, you might say, transmit and maintain a particular Islamic tradition, legal institutions emerged, at least in part, as a way of kind of negotiating between Islamic traditions, particularly from South Asia, and the English legal system. Indeed, what's interesting about these institutions is that they do not simply operate according to the norms of the mainly South Asian legal traditions with which their founders were familiar. David Pearl and Werner Menski, the latter pictured there, in their work on Muslim law in Britain, popularised the term Angrezi Shariat, English Sharia literally translated, as a way of trying to highlight the fact that during the last few decades, forms of Islamic law have emerged in this country that are clearly distinguishable from the from the legal traditions in the regions from which most British Muslims originate. Their very existence, therefore, is a testament to institutional transitions within Islam in Britain. That having been said, I should say, and I don't mind admitting, that this case, as you research it, is harder to speak of in a kind of an affirmative way than the other two. And that's primarily simply because of the subject matter. As some people here might know, Islamic legal institutions, their main business is divorce, largely because of the way that the Islamic legal tradition has historically afforded men, but not necessarily women, the right to unilateral divorce. So exploring this subject, one comes across sometimes very painful cases of domestic breakdown. Some of these involve criminal as well as civil law. Many of them involve legal ambiguity, notably marriages that have religious but not civil status. And while Islamic legal institutions do offer a sort of route out of failed marriages for some people, and they are in many cases a useful mediation forum, their contribution is not always a positive one. That's certainly what the current research base seems to suggest. Nevertheless, even in this context, I think the kind of thesis I'm trying to advance remains valid. I think it's possible to map real meaningful transitions in the sphere of British Islam, in spite of some very real problems. To start, I think it's helpful to alter the way we tend to think about legal institutions. The debate, both in media coverage following Rowan Williams' lecture in 2008 and in scholarly accounts of Islamic law, usually focuses on possible state recognition of such institutions. Should Islamic legal institutions be delegated some kind of authority by the state? Which is, I should say, absolutely fine as a discussion to be having, but I think if it's the only vocabulary with which researchers, critics, legal theorists engage with Islamic law, it runs the risk of treating it, you might say, as a kind of determined set of practices or a code that governments can respond to in a range of ways, either from incorporation within the state to prohibition by the state. I think it helps also to think of Islamic law as a dynamic conversation, as I put up there, which is, after all, kind of what the Islamic legal tradition has always been, albeit one with certain norms. And if we do this, I think our attention can be drawn away to a certain extent from the outcomes of specific cases and the good or bad experiences of individuals who use Islamic legal institutions, and toward ways in which religious leaders and activists are trying to negotiate a suitable place for Islamic family norms. One thing, for example, that our debates about Islamic law often neglect are the range of positions that one can find, even among the leaders of Islamic legal institutions. So we're most familiar with what we might call formal recognition, judgments of Islamic legal institutions being recognised in English law as binding. And that is a position that some leaders of Islamic legal institutions take, such as, for example, Abu Sa'id of the Islamic Sharia Council in Leytonstone. Alongside this, however, one can encounter the position that Islamic legal institutions should remain unofficial but kind of act as a complement, with such institutions supporting the civil system while mediating between minority and majority orders where necessary. That's the position of the Muslim Law Sharia Council based in Ealing, for example. Finally, one can also come across what one might call advocacy of a kind of overlapping consensus, by which I mean the notion that because Islamic and civil law are similar in form, civil legal processes can be regarded as Islamic. I've seen this advocated wholesale by religious leaders based outside of Islamic legal institutions, and in more piecemeal form by those working within them. The late Syed Ad-Dash, for example, formerly of the Islamic Sharia Council, stated when he was alive that civil marriage, an English civil marriage, amounts to a correct Islamic marriage. These varying positions then have to be set against a backdrop of activism by civil society organisations. For example, the Muslim Institute, along with representatives from other organisations, launched an alternative marriage contract on the right there, which had the central aim of equalising the right to end an Islamic marriage. That particular effort stalled, as it happened, in the face of opposition. It took place in around 2008, as I say, but literally in the last few days, this activism has continued, and Muslim Women's Network UK, drawing from the earlier case, I think, has made available information and guidance on Muslim marriage and divorce aimed at Muslim women in Britain. And then finally, one can see certain ways in which, even within the existing legal framework that English and Welsh law provides, Islamic norms are in a sense kind of taken into account. John R. Bowen, for example, has looked at the case of Udim versus Chowdhury, which is a dispute over the return of a bride gift in the case of a divorce, where the court decided that an Islamic marriage contract had English legal force, and even drew on an Islamic scholar to provide expert advice in the case. And I think these more subtle interactions, which I can only really glance at here, are perhaps where the integration of Islam with English law looks, to me, most promising. Final case, which I'll try and go through quickly because I'm running a bit short on time. So I want to cover this particular topic by taking aim at kind of two stereotypes concerning Muslim government relations. Stereotype one looks a bit like this, that Muslim civil society organisations are deeply conservative entities led by older, male, self-appointed leaders, most of whom are not born in the UK, some of whom have affiliations with Islamist revival movements overseas. That's a perspective one finds regularly in academic and media contexts, and indeed it was central to Ruth Kelly's argument in 2006 that government relations with Muslim partners needed to be rebalanced in her terms. Now, of course, there's some truth to this stereotype, but I think I'd encourage people to, and this is drawing on some of the research Michael mentioned at the start, think about Muslim representation in a slightly updated way. So I want to refer just briefly to research as part of the Muslim Participation in Contemporary Governance project led by my former colleague Therese O'Toole, the University of Bristol, which involved examining the diverse ways in which Muslims have engaged with government locally and nationally. And that necessarily involved engagement with questions of Muslim representation. And we encountered what we call 4 distinct modes of representation. The simplistic accounts tend to focus on what we called representation by delegation, the kind I started off with, which involves building up a kind of grassroots support from civil society infrastructure and using that to establish some kind of credibility. The Muslim Council of Britain is the exemplary case of this, I think. There are others as well. And that model is effective in some ways, but usually reliant upon established religious or community infrastructures, and so to some extent at least reflects the power dynamics that are going on within those kinds of infrastructures. What these kind of accounts neglect, however, is, as I put at the top there, the extent of competitive claims making within British Muslim civil society, not just between different kind of delegate representatives, as it were, between these and other types of representation. So we encountered representative claims that were enabled by and sometimes grounded in religious authority, the public standing of Muslim politicians and journalists, and the expertise of particular individuals involved in governance networks who worked in areas such as equalities law. And now, bearing in mind my earlier comments about Muslim women in particular entering high-level professions, I think it was striking in our research that this kind of representation through expertise allowed a range of Muslim women who had experience and expertise in a different third sector and private sector context to bypass conventional representative structures. So that's one way I think we're dealing with what we might call a maturation of Muslim civil society. The same kind of shifts can be seen in certain forms of internal reform within Islamic organisations themselves. The Islamic Society of Britain, for example, has witnessed quite radical change, similar in kind to the Mottfield Institute. And so then on to my second stereotype, which I think is prevalent mainly among academic commentators. And that's sort of cast back to my original point in a way. The policy toward British Muslims is characterised by a range of strategies designed to contain dissent and discipline Muslim communities, domesticate Islam. And from this perspective, Prevent is regarded as a kind of top-down sort of technology of control, as it were. Now, of course, again, this has a lot of force, and I hope you can see that from what I've already said in the talk. But within our research, and this is something we've covered in one of the articles that Michael mentioned at the start, we found considerable evidence of Muslim organisations negotiating terms with government, altering the shape and character of policy delivery, and setting up alternative initiatives that don't rely on government support. These range from Abdul Haq Baker, who's on the right there. He led an organisation called Street, which refused to engage with the security services. St Philip's Centre, represented by the image on the left, which is a Leicester-based organisation which took over the delivery of Prevent strategy against the wishes of central government. And so all of this, I think, ultimately suggests a kind of emerging, more mature, more multifaceted, what Tariq Modood would call a democratic constellation of Muslim civil society activism. So just to draw this to a conclusion then. So I hope I've given you kind of a sense of what I mean when I talk about British Islam and how this account sort of differs from that offered by politicians in this country. And I hope it sort of gives some indication of why the difference between those kinds of accounts matters. Now, I'm not, for a minute, I should say, suggesting that all is well in Britain's Muslim population. But I think I am increasingly certain that when looked at over the long term, looked at over a range of different contexts institutionally, you can begin to map out a gradual, slow shift that adds up to something quite significant. And it seems to me that if this kind of looks like a kind of an emerging British Islam, we may as well just call it that. I want to say something also about what is wrong with what I've been calling a kind of a priori narrative about British Islam. So now, prejudice and hostility towards Islam, I think, is fostered through a wide variety of means. But increasingly, I think, it works through what you might call a kind of denial of institutional change. There are various different cases in the media and in policy discourse that I could refer to here. So organisations are described as fronts for Islamist radicals. Prison chaplains have been accused of failing to promote British values by people who cannot see, or perhaps even just refuse to see, the sometimes dramatic changes that are happening within British Islamic institutions. So, just to conclude, I wonder if researchers of Islam in Britain, such as myself, as Michael, and various people within this particular institution, I wonder if we ought to be sort of speaking a bit more openly or clearly about these kinds of changes. Ultimately, I think I don't really mind if someone doesn't think the notion or concept of a British Islam is meaningful to them. What does, I think, worry me, though, is that the hostility towards it, in a way, is masking this kind of transition and preventing us from kind of naming what is happening right before our eyes. And that's where I'll end and go for questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you.